The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official seal and bold red stamps making Sarah Chen's coffee taste bitter before she even opened it. She stood in her kitchen, still in her pajamas, watching the rain streak down the window as she read the words that would turn her quiet suburban life upside down. Notice of legal action, violation of community covenantes. Sarah had lived at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive for 3 years, ever since her divorce was finalized, and she'd needed a fresh start. The modest two-story house with its small backyard had been perfect, affordable, peaceful, and far enough from her old life to help her heal. She'd chosen this particular neighborhood specifically because it seemed friendly and low-key, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association had other ideas. According to the letter signed by HOA President Margaret Thornfield, Sarah's recently installed privacy fence was in flagrant violation of community standards. The 6-foot cedar barrier she'd erected along her back property line was apparently 2 inches too tall, constructed without proper permits, and most damning of all, built using the wrong type of wood stain that didn't match the approved earth tone palette. Sarah laughed out loud, a sharp sound that echoed in her empty kitchen. 2 inches. They were threatening legal action over 2 inches and the wrong shade of brown. The fence had been a necessity, not a decoration. When she'd moved in, Sarah had been charmed by the open feel of the neighborhood, the way backyards flowed into each other with only token barriers. But charm quickly wore thin when she realized her next-door neighbor, Bob Henley, had an unobstructed view directly into her bedroom window. The man seemed to spend an unusual amount of time gardening near the property line, always managing to look up just as Sarah was getting dressed or undressed. After months of awkward encounters and carefully drawn curtains, Sarah had decided enough was enough. She researched local ordinances, saved up the money, and hired Rodriguez Fencing to install what she thought was a perfectly reasonable privacy barrier. The fence was beautiful, solid cedar planks that smelled like Christmas morning, with decorative post caps that caught the morning light just right. Now, apparently, it was a criminal offense. The letter went on to detail the HOA's demands: immediate removal of the offending fence, payment of $2,500 in fines for unauthorized construction, and another $1,200 for legal and administrative costs. If Sarah didn't comply within 30 days, the HOA would file a lawsuit seeking additional damages and a court order for demolition. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, the letter trembling in her hands. She was a freelance graphic designer, still building her client base after the career disruption of her divorce. The fence had already stretched her budget to its limits. There was no way she could afford thousands in fines, let alone legal fees if this went to court. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lisa. "Coffee later? You sound stressed." Sarah hadn't realized she'd been stressed until that moment, but now she could feel the tension creeping up her neck, the familiar knot forming between her shoulder blades that had plagued her during the worst days of her marriage. She'd moved to Willowbrook to escape conflict, to find peace. Instead, she apparently stumbled into a neighborhood war zone ruled by petty tyrants with measuring tapes and bad attitudes. Outside, the rain was picking up, drumming against her kitchen window with increasing intensity. Sarah watched the water cascade down the glass, distorting her view of the backyard where her supposedly criminal fence stood guard. In the distance, she could see the clubhouse of the Willowbrook Community Center, its red tile roof barely visible through the storm. She'd attended exactly one HOA meeting since moving in, a mind-numbing affair dominated by arguments about holiday decoration guidelines and heated debates over the proper height of mailbox posts. Margaret Thornfield had presided over that meeting like a general commanding troops, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her pale blue eyes scanning the room for signs of dissent. Sarah remembered thinking the woman took herself too seriously, but she'd had no idea just how seriously until now. The letter concluded with a final insult: failure to comply will result in immediate legal action and potential placement of a lion against your property. Sarah folded the letter carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. She learned during her divorce that panic was the enemy of clear thinking, that emotional reactions led to poor decisions. But beneath her forced calm, something harder was crystallizing, a determination that surprised her with its intensity. They wanted to fight over 2 inches in the wrong shade of brown. Fine. They were about to discover that Sarah Chen wasn't the pushover they thought she was. Story outline, remaining parts. Part 2. The investigation begins. Sarah hires a lawyer and begins researching property records, discovering discrepancies in the neighborhood's original surveys while gathering evidence to fight the HOA's demands. Part 3. The shocking discovery. While reviewing historical property documents, Sarah uncovers evidence that the community pool and part of the clubhouse are actually built on her property, not HOA land as everyone believed. Part 4. The tables turn. Armed with proof of the encroachment, Sarah confronts the HOA and demands they remove their illegal structures from her land, turning their own legal tactics against them. Part 5. Victory and Resolution. The HOA drops all charges against Sarah's fence and pays her significant compensation for years of unauthorized use of her property, while she keeps both her fence and her dignity intact. Sarah Chen had always been methodical, a trait that served her well in graphic design and had helped her survive her divorce. Now facing the HOA's legal threat, she channeled that same systematic approach into something she never imagined doing: preparing for war. The morning after receiving the certified letter, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, 3 cups of coffee, and a growing pile of printed documents. She barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and strategies. If the Willowbrook HOA wanted to play hardball over 2 inches of fence height, she'd make sure she understood every rule in their playbook. Her first call was to Janet Rodriguez, whose company had installed the fence. Janet's voice was apologetic but firm when Sarah explained the situation. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I feel terrible about this, but my guys did exactly what you asked for. We built your property line, used standard 6-foot panels, and followed all the city codes. We never heard anything about HOA restrictions being different from city requirements." "What about permits?" Sarah asked, making notes on her legal pad. "That's the thing. City doesn't require permits for fences under 8 feet on residential property. Your fence is perfectly legal according to municipal code. This HOA stuff is news to me." After hanging up, Sarah pulled up the Willowbrook Community Covenants online. The document was in mind-numbing 47 pages of restrictions covering everything from house paint colors to the acceptable breeds of dogs. Buried on page 32, she found the fence regulations: maximum height of 70 inches, requiring pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee and mandating the use of approved materials and finishes. Sarah measured her fence with a contractor's tape measure she borrowed from her neighbor across the street. 74 inches. 4 inches over the limit, not 2 as the HOA had claimed. They couldn't even get their threatening letters right. But the more Sarah read, the more questions arose. The covenant language was strangely vague in places and contradictory in others. Section 12.3 stated that all improvements required HOA approval, but Section 15.7 seemed to suggest that boundary fences were exempt from architectural review. The document referenced original plat maps and recorded easements without actually including them. By noon, Sarah had filled 6 pages with questions and inconsistencies. She needed professional help. Attorney David Kim's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that specialized in helping regular people fight bureaucratic battles. Sarah had found him through online reviews that praised his work against overzealous HOAs and municipal overreach. Kim was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a desk covered in case files that suggested he stayed busy fighting other people's David and Goliath battles. "HOA fence dispute," he said, scanning Sarah's documentation. "These are becoming more common. Some of these associations have gotten drunk on their own power." He looked up at her. "Tell me about your neighborhood. How long has this HOA been active?" "The development was built about 15 years ago," Sarah said. "I moved in 3 years ago, and honestly, I barely paid attention to the HOA stuff. They seemed pretty quiet until now." Kim nodded, making notes. "That's typical. New HOAs often start out reasonable, but as the original developer moves on and property values rise, they sometimes get more aggressive about enforcement. The fence issue might just be the beginning." He leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I'm seeing. Their own covenant document has some problems. The language around fences is ambiguous, and they're citing municipal codes that don't actually apply to HOA regulations. More importantly, they're demanding fines and fees without following their own enforcement procedures." Sarah felt a spark of hope. "So they can't just demand I tear down the fence?" "Not without due process. According to their own rules, they should have sent you a notice of violation first, given you 30 days to respond, held a hearing if you contested it, and only then proceeded with fines. They jumped straight to the nuclear option." Kim tapped his pen against his desk. "That suggests either incompetence or intimidation tactics. Maybe both. What's our next step?" "I'll draft a response challenging their authority and demanding they follow their own procedures. But I also recommend we dig deeper into the property records. HOA disputes often reveal interesting things about boundary lines and easements. Sometimes the people throwing stones live in glass houses." Kim gave Sarah a list of documents to request from the county recorder's office: the original subdivision plat, all recorded easements, property surveys, and the HOA's articles of incorporation. "Yeah, everything you can. Real estate records tell stories, and sometimes those stories surprise everyone involved." That afternoon, Sarah found herself in the basement of the county administration building, surrounded by dusty file boxes and decades-old survey maps. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy who seemed to genuinely enjoy helping people navigate the bureaucratic maze, pulled file after file for the Willowbrook subdivision. "This is a big development," Dorothy said, spreading out the original plat map on a large table. 15 years ago was right before the housing boom really took off. Developers were moving fast, sometimes cutting corners on the paperwork. Sarah studied the map, trying to orient herself. There was her street, Maple Ridge Drive, and there was her lot, number 47. The boundaries looked clear enough, but something seemed off about the scale. The lots appeared larger on the original plat than they felt in reality. "Dorothy," Sarah said, "is it normal for there to be differences between the original plat and what actually got built?" The older woman's eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh, honey, you'd be surprised how often that happens. Developers sometimes make adjustments during construction, moving the roads slightly, adjusting drainage, working around unexpected obstacles. Not all of those changes get properly recorded." She pulled out another folder. "Let's look at the actual surveys from when construction was completed." Dorothy spread out a series of individual lot surveys, each stamped and signed by licensed surveyors. "These should show the real boundaries." Sarah found her lot survey and compared it to the original plat. At first glance, they looked identical, but as she studied the measurements more carefully, discrepancies began to emerge. According to the original plat, her back property line should be 180 feet from the street, but the final survey showed 185 feet. 5 extra feet. 5 feet that, according to the original plan, should have been part of the common area where the community amenities were built. Sarah Chen spent the weekend spread across her living room floor like a detective working a cold case. Survey maps, property deeds, and construction documents covered every surface, held down by coffee mugs and weighted with law books borrowed from David Kim's office. Her laptop screen glowed with county GIS maps while her printer worked overtime, churning out document after document that might hold the key to her fence dispute. What had started as a simple property line verification was turning into something far more complex and potentially explosive. The breakthrough came on Sunday evening just as Sarah was considering calling it quits for the day. She'd been cross-referencing the original 2009 subdivision plat with the individual lot surveys completed in 2010. Looking for the source of those mysterious 5 extra feet her property seemed to have gained. The measurements had been making her eyes water for hours, but she was determined to understand every inch of her land. That's when she noticed something odd about Lot 23. Lot 23 belonged to the HOA. It was the parcel where they built the community center, pool, and recreational facilities that served as the crown jewel of Willowbrook's amenities. According to the original plat, Lot 23 was supposed to be a perfect rectangle, 300 feet wide by 400 feet deep, positioned at the back of the development where it would provide a natural gathering place for residents. But when Sarah compared that original plan to the final survey, the numbers didn't match. The survey showed Lot 23 as being only 280 feet wide, 20 feet narrower than originally planned. Those missing 20 feet had to go somewhere, and as Sarah traced the property lines with increasing excitement, she realized exactly where they'd gone. Her lot and the lots of her immediate neighbors had each gained approximately 5 feet in depth during the final survey process. Sarah grabbed her calculator and started working backwards from the community center's actual location. If her property line extended 5 feet further than everyone thought, and if the original plans had placed the pool area exactly 400 feet from the street, then the current pool would be sitting. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to her empty living room. She ran the numbers again, certain she made an error. But the math was unforgiving and consistent. According to the recorded surveys, the legal documents that determined actual property ownership, approximately 15 feet of the community pool area was built on her land. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her phone to call David Kim, then stopped herself. It was Sunday night, and this discovery was too important to rush. She needed to be absolutely certain before making accusations that could upend the entire neighborhood. Monday morning found Sarah back at the county administration building, this time armed with specific questions and a growing sense of urgency. Dorothy, the helpful clerk, took one look at Sarah's focused expression and cleared her schedule. "You've got that look," Dorothy said with a knowing smile. "The same look people get right before they discover something that's going to change everything. What did you find?" Sarah spread out her documents on the familiar table. "I think there's been a major surveying error that nobody caught for 15 years. The community pool might be partially built on private property." Dorothy's eyebrows shot up. "That would be problematic. Let me pull the construction permits and final inspections from that time period." What they found in the permit files was even more damning than Sarah had hoped. The original construction permits for the pool had been issued based on the preliminary plat map, not the final recorded surveys. When the surveying adjustments were made in 2010, moving property lines to accommodate drainage issues and road modifications, Nobody had gone back to check whether the already constructed community facilities were still on the right parcels. "This is a mess," Dorothy said, shaking her head as she reviewed the chronology. The pool was built in 2009 based on the original plan, but the property lines were finalized in 2010 after construction was complete. Classic example of the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and disbelief. So for 15 years, the HOA has been operating facilities that are partially on private property. "Looks that way, and not just your property." Dorothy traced the boundary lines with her finger. "If these measurements are correct, they're also encroaching on lots 48 and 49. Your neighbors Tom and Patricia Williams and the Johnson family." The scope of the problem was staggering. The HOA hadn't just made a minor property line error. They'd been trespassing on private land for over a decade, using it for their most valuable community amenity. Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications. The same HOA that was threatening to sue her over 4 inches of fence height had been illegally occupying 15 feet of her property without permission, compensation, or apparently even awareness. That evening, Sarah called David Kim and carefully explained her discoveries. The lawyer listened in silence as she walked through the survey discrepancies, the construction timeline, and the permit issues. "Sarah," Kim said when she finished, "if what you're telling me is accurate, this completely changes the dynamics of your case. We're not just talking about defending against their fence complaint anymore. We're talking about a major property rights violation that's been ongoing for 15 years. What does that mean exactly?" "It means they've been trespassing on your land and probably owe you significant compensation for the unauthorized use. In property law, when someone uses your land without permission, even unknowingly, you're entitled to fair rental value for that usage. For 15 years of commercial recreational use," Kim paused to calculate, "we could be talking about tens of thousands of dollars." Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, staring out at her controversial fence. The wooden barrier that had started this whole mess now seemed like a minor detail in a much larger story. "There's more," Kim continued. "If they're going to claim your fence violates property setbacks or HOA regulations, we need to establish exactly where your property lines actually are. And if your property extends further than they think, their entire case against your fence might collapse. So what's our next step? We hire a professional surveyor to confirm what you found. If the survey supports your research, we'll have them over a barrel. The HOA that's threatening to sue you for a minor fence violation will be facing a much bigger legal problem of their own." After hanging up, Sarah walked to her back door and looked out at her fence. Beyond it, she could see the community pool area, where families gathered on summer evenings and children played while their parents socialized. It was a beautiful facility that added real value to the neighborhood. It was also, apparently, sitting on her land. Sarah felt a strange mixture of power and responsibility. She'd moved to Willowbrook for peace and quiet, not to become the center of a property dispute that could affect every resident in the development. But the HOA enforced this confrontation with their heavy-handed tactics and threats. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lisa. "How's the fence war going?" Sarah looked at the message and smiled grimly. "It's not about the fence anymore," she texted back. "It's about to become much bigger than that." As darkness fell over Willowbrook, Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching the underwater lights of the community pool cast wavering reflections on her fence. Tomorrow, she would hire a surveyor and begin the process of officially documenting what she discovered. The professional survey results arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered in a thick manila envelope that felt like it contained dynamite. Sarah Chen sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling slightly as she opened the report from Precision Land Surveying, the same firm the county had recommended for their accuracy and courtroom credibility. The numbers were even more damaging than she hoped. According to the licensed surveyor's precise measurements, Sarah's property extended 18.3 feet further than the assumed boundary line. Not only was the community pool partially on her land, but so was a section of the pool deck, the poolside pergola, and approximately 400 square feet of the meticulously maintained landscaping that the HOA proudly featured in their promotional materials. David Kim had been equally stunned when Sarah called him with the results. "This is unprecedented in my experience," he'd said. "The HOA isn't just wrong about your fence. They've been operating commercial recreational facilities on your private property for 15 years without any legal right to do so. Now, armed with professional documentation and legal backing, it was time to turn the tables." The monthly HOA board meeting was scheduled for that evening at 7 o'clock in the community center, the same building that, according to Sarah's research, was partially built on property that didn't belong to the association. The irony wasn't lost on her as she prepared for what would likely be the most confrontational meeting of her life. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio containing copies of the survey, the original construction permits, and a legal demand letter that Kim had crafted with surgical precision. The community center's main room was already filling with residents, most of whom seemed to be attending out of curiosity about the fence dispute that had become neighborhood gossip. Margaret Thornfield sat at the head table with 4 other board members, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic severe bun, her pale blue eyes scanning the room with obvious irritation. Sarah recognized the look. This was a woman accustomed to having her authority go unchallenged. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Thornfield announced without preamble, we need to address the ongoing violation of community standards by Mrs. Chen on Maple Ridge Drive. As you all know, she has refused to comply with our reasonable request to modify her non-conforming fence. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the opening she hoped for. I'd like to respectfully request that my situation be moved to new business, Sarah said, standing up. I have some important information that the board needs to review before proceeding with any action against my fence. Thornfield's expression darkened. Mrs. Chen, you were given ample opportunity to address this matter privately. The time for negotiation has passed. Actually, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I think you'll find that the situation has changed significantly. I've discovered some serious issues with property boundaries that affect this entire community. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah could see neighbors turning to look at each other with confused expressions. This wasn't the routine fence complaint they'd expected. Board member Robert Hayes leaned forward. What kind of boundary issues? Sarah opened her portfolio and pulled out the surveyor's report. I hired a professional surveyor to confirm the exact location of my property lines. What we discovered is that there have been significant errors in the assumed boundaries of several lots in this development, including mine. Thornfield's face was flushing red. Mrs. Chen, your property boundaries are clearly established in your deed and have nothing to do with your fence violation. Actually, they have everything to do with it, Sarah replied. She walked to the front of the room, her confidence growing with each step. According to this professional survey, my property extends 18.3 feet further than everyone has assumed for the past 15 years. She turned to face the room, making eye contact with her neighbors. That means approximately 400 square feet of the community pool area, including part of the pool itself, the deck, and the pergola, are actually built on my private property. The room erupted in startled conversations. Sarah could see shock, disbelief, and growing anger on the faces around her. These people paid HOA fees for access to amenities that were apparently sitting on private land. That's impossible, Thornfield sputtered. The pool was built according to approved plans on HOA property. The pool was built according to the preliminary plat map from 2009, Sarah corrected. But the final property surveys weren't completed until 2010, after construction was finished. When the surveyors made adjustments to accommodate drainage and road issues, nobody checked whether the already built facilities were still on the correct parcels. She handed copies of the survey report to the board members. This is a professional survey conducted by Precision Land Surveying, the same firm the county uses for legal disputes. The measurements are precise and legally defensible. Board Treasurer Janet Morrison was studying the survey with obvious alarm. Margaret, if this is accurate, we have a major problem. We've been maintaining and operating facilities on property we don't own. It gets worse, Sarah continued. According to my research, my neighbors at lots 48 and 49 are also affected. The Williamses and the Johnsons probably have similar encroachments on their property. Tom Williams, a quiet man who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up slowly. Are you saying the HOA has been using our land without permission? For 15 years, Sarah confirmed, and under property law, unauthorized use of private land, even if it's unknowing, requires compensation to the property owners. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. David Kim had explained to Sarah that the fair rental value for commercial recreational use of prime residential land could easily amount to hundreds of dollars per month per affected property. Multiplied by 15 years and 3 properties, the HOA could be facing a financial liability in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Margaret Thornfield was no longer red-faced, she had gone pale. This requires investigation. We need to hire our own surveyor to verify these claims. That's your right, Sarah agreed. But while you're investigating, I think we should discuss the elephant in the room. This board has threatened me with legal action over a fence that may actually be entirely on my own property, while simultaneously operating commercial facilities on that same property without my permission. She pulled out David Kim's demand letter. My attorney has prepared a formal notice regarding the trespass and unauthorized use of my property. The HOA has 30 days to respond with either a plan for removing the encroaching structures or a proposal for fair compensation for past and ongoing use. Sarah set the letter on the table in front of Thornfield. The choice is yours. You can continue with your lawsuit over my fence, in which case my attorney will immediately file a countersuit for property rights violations and seek damages for 15 years of unauthorized use. Or we can work together to resolve this situation fairly." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could hear the wall clock ticking and the distant hum of the pool filtration system, the pool that was apparently sitting on her land. Board member Patricia Knox finally spoke up. "Margaret, we need to table the fence issue immediately and call an emergency executive session. This is way beyond our normal scope." "I agree," said Robert Hayes. "We need legal counsel before we say another word." Thornfield looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. The woman who had been so confident in her authority, so quick to threaten legal action over trivial violations, was now facing a crisis that could bankrupt the association and expose the board to personal liability. "This meeting is adjourned," she said quietly. "The board will reconvene in executive session tomorrow evening." As residents filed out of the community center, Sarah could hear fragments of heated conversations. Some neighbors seemed angry at the HOA for creating this mess, while others appeared skeptical of Sarah's claims. But she could see the worry in everyone's eyes. If the survey was correct, the community they all invested in was built on a foundation of legal quicksand. Tom Williams approached Sarah as she gathered her documents. "Is this really true? About our properties?" "I believe so," Sarah replied. "I'd recommend you and the Johnsons consider." 3 weeks after the explosive HOA meeting, Sarah Chen received another certified letter. This time, however, she opened it with a smile instead of dread. The return address showed the law offices of Henderson, Martinez, and Associates, not the HOA's usual legal counsel, but a prestigious firm that specialized in complex property disputes and damage control. The letter was addressed to Ms. Sarah Chen and legal counsel, and began with words Sarah had never expected to read. "The Willowbrook Homeowners Association wishes to formally apologize for the misunderstanding regarding your property fence and to propose a mutually beneficial resolution to recent boundary discoveries." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and settled in to savor every word of what amounted to complete surrender. The HOA's own survey, conducted by an independent firm, had confirmed Sarah's findings almost exactly. Their measurements showed 18.7 feet of encroachment, slightly more than Sarah's survey had indicated. More damaging still, when Tom Williams and the Johnson family had commissioned their own surveys, they discovered similar boundary violations affecting their properties. The association was facing potential liability of over $300,000 in back rent for unauthorized land use, plus the astronomical cost of either relocating community facilities or purchasing the affected land at fair market value. The board had spent the past 3 weeks in emergency sessions with attorneys, accountants, and insurance representatives, trying to find a way out of the crisis they created. Sarah's phone rang as she finished reading the settlement offer. David Kim sounded almost giddy with professional satisfaction. "Sarah, they're offering everything we could have hoped for and more. Complete dismissal of all fence complaints, formal acknowledgement that your fence is legally compliant on your actual property boundaries, and $85,000 in compensation for past unauthorized use of your land." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. $85,000. Plus, they're offering to purchase the encroached portion of your property for an additional $65,000, which would give them legal right to keep the pool facilities where they are. Total package, $150,000. Plus, they cover all your legal fees and surveying costs. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had installed her fence for $3,200 and had been facing $3,700 in HOA fines and fees. Now, the same organization was offering her enough money to pay off her mortgage and still have a substantial nest egg remaining. What about the Williams and Johnson families? Similar offers proportional to their affected acreage. The HOA is basically buying their way out of the biggest legal mess in the development's history. But money wasn't Sarah's only consideration. She'd spent weeks thinking about what this resolution would mean for her neighborhood and her neighbors. The community pool and facilities were genuinely valuable amenities that enhanced property values and quality of life for everyone in Willowbrook. Destroying them over a principle, however justified, would hurt innocent families who had nothing to do with the HOA's bullying tactics. "David, I want to accept the settlement, but with one additional condition." "What's that?" "I want Margaret Thornfield and the entire board to resign. They created this mess through incompetence and arrogance, and they shouldn't be allowed to continue mismanaging community affairs." Kim chuckled. "That's going to be a tough sell. Board positions are elected, not appointed. Then make it part of the settlement that the HOA calls for new elections within 60 days and that the current board publicly acknowledges their errors in management. If they want to avoid complete financial ruin, they can sacrifice their volunteer positions." 2 days later, Sarah sat in the conference room of Henderson, Martinez, and Associates, across from a deflated-looking Margaret Thornfield and 3 remaining board members. The fifth member had already resigned in anticipation of the legal fallout. Thornfield looked nothing like the imperious association president who had ruled HOA meetings with an iron fist. Her silver hair seemed grayer, her pale blue eyes had lost their sharp edge, and she spoke in subdued tones that suggested she finally understood the scope of her mistakes. "Ms. Chen," Thornfield began, "the board accepts full responsibility for the boundary oversight and the inappropriate enforcement actions regarding your fence. We agree to all terms of the proposed settlement, including the resignation of current board members and scheduling of new elections." Sarah studied the woman who had once threatened her with lawsuits and lions. Part of her felt sympathy for someone who had clearly been trying to maintain community standards, however misguided her methods. But a larger part remembered the stress, the sleepless nights, and the arrogant assumption that a homeowner wouldn't fight back against institutional bullying. "Mrs. Thornfield," Sarah said quietly, "this situation could have been avoided if the board had approached property concerns with respect instead of threats. I hope the new leadership will remember that HOA members are neighbors, not subjects to be ruled." The settlement documents were signed with little fanfare. Sarah walked out of the law office as the owner of a smaller but legally clear property and significantly wealthier than she'd been when she first installed her controversial fence. But the real victory came 3 months later during the first HOA meeting under new leadership. The new board president, Tom Williams, opened the meeting with a revised mission statement emphasizing collaboration over enforcement and communication over confrontation. "We've learned some hard lessons about the importance of accuracy, humility, and treating our neighbors with respect," Williams announced to a packed community center. The previous board's approach to governance created problems that cost this association nearly $500,000 in settlements and legal fees. That will never happen again under our watch. Sarah attended that meeting not as a defendant, but as a homeowner in good standing whose fence was now officially compliant with all regulations, since the regulations have been updated to reflect actual property boundaries rather than assumed ones. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Sarah to thank her for forcing the boundary survey that had revealed problems affecting multiple properties. The Johnson family had discovered their garden shed was actually 3 feet onto a HOA common area, which explained years of maintenance disputes. Another resident learned that a drainage easement on his deed was mislocated, clearing up chronic flooding issues. "You did us all a favor by fighting back," Tom Williams told Sarah as they walked out together. That old board had gotten way too comfortable throwing their weight around. As summer arrived, Sarah found herself spending more time in her backyard, no longer worried about nosy neighbors or HOA complaints. Her fence provided the privacy she wanted, her bank account reflected the value of standing up to bullies, and her neighborhood had learned valuable lessons about the importance of competent, respectful leadership. The community pool still sparkled in the evening light, now sitting entirely on land the HOA legally owned thanks to Sarah's settlement. Children still played in the water while their parents socialized on the deck. The only difference was that everyone now understood exactly where the property lines were and how much trouble assumptions could cause. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes sit on her back deck with a glass of wine, looking at the fence that had changed her life. The cedar planks had weathered to a beautiful silver gray that no HOA regulation could have mandated, and the privacy they provided felt more valuable than ever. Her sister Lisa had asked her once if she regretted the stress and conflict of fighting the HOA. Sarah's answer was simple. She regretted that it had been necessary, but she didn't regret standing up for herself when bullies tried to push her around. The fence was still 6 inches taller than the old HOA regulations had allowed. It was still built with a wrong type of wood stain, according to the previous architectural guidelines. But it was also completely legal, sitting entirely on Sarah's own property and protected by a legal settlement that had cost the association more money than they'd spent on community improvements in the previous 5 years combined. Sometimes the best defense against institutional bullying was simply refusing to